Welcome to another episode of our Argumenta Distinguished Lecture series. This is a lecture series organized by our project called Rethinking the Serviceability of Economics to Society, ReSES. The project is funded by the Finnish Cultural Foundation, and we have been organizing these events that are about the ability of economics to serve the society. Today, it's our honor and pleasure to have Professor Geoffrey Hodgson. He's Professor Emeritus in Management at Loughborough University, London, and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Institutional Economics. He is one of the founders of the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy and the other canon, both of which contributed significantly to the development of heterodox economics research. More recently, Professor Hodgson co-founded the World Interdisciplinary Network for Institutional Research. He has written on a wide variety of topics. Including institutional economics, capitalism, evolutionary economics, history and methodology of economics, Marxism. He is highly cited and influential author with an impressive track record. He has hundreds of articles listed in Google Scholar, boasting an impressive citation count of 46,000 and still counting. His most cited article has more than 5,000 citations. If I counted correctly, he is the author of 22 academic books, not including the edited volumes. With his books and articles, he has shaped the scholarly discussion on evolutionary economics, institutional economics, social and economic evolution, methodology of economics, and capitalism. His latest book, The Wealth of a Nation, promises to be another important addition to his body of work. Today's lecture will be closely related to this forthcoming book. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hodgson to give his lecture on the origins and development of capitalism.
Thank you very much, Emma, for those very kind words. It's a great pleasure and honor for me too, especially to be in this lovely city of Helsinki. I've been here a few times, but not for a while, so it's nice to be back again and to see some old friends. What I'm going to talk about is already clear from the first slide. It's based on my recent book, which is just published, just available. It's available in the US in hard copy, and it's also available everywhere in Kindle. And sometime the ship will arrive in Europe with the copies for Europeans as well. So anyway, the aim of the book is to discuss the institutional conditions for the rise of capitalism, focusing on one case, which is the English case. I don't even discuss Scottish law or Irish issues, which are of course interesting and complex, but one has to focus after all. But I'll try and explain what the argument's basically about. And it's about the kind of things that matter for the establishment of a modern economic system, which we might call capitalism. This graph, which is Angus Maddison's data, if you've done an economic history, you know about the data sets late Angus Maddison created over long periods of time, comparing different economies on a measure of GDP per capita. We all know what's wrong with that measure. It's a limited measure, and we need alternatives. But so far, these are the only extensive figures we have on economic development over such a long period. And you can see from the graphs that you have this takeoff for various countries, USA, UK, Western Europe, and so on, and also some different stories for Latin America, China, India, and Africa. In every case, there is some growth. In some cases, it's spectacular. Hopefully, other countries or less laggard countries which are behind, less developed, will catch up to. That's an important agenda, and that's why this research is important, because it may illuminate conditions which may apply to less developed countries as well, the kind of things they need to look at least to develop. It doesn't mean they have to develop in the same way. There's different paths of development. But the point is here that the change is spectacular. You can see the takeoff. Just want you to note there has been some slow change in this period from about just before 1600 up to the takeoff period, the big hockey stick rise in GDP per capita. That's of interest because that's about the preconditions for the big takeoff here. So if you take one indicator, Western European GDP per capita, in 300 years, it's 20 times greater. That's only a few generations. We're talking about our great-great-grandparents or a generation round about then. We are, on average, 20 times richer. Of course, there's winners and losers. Some people are a lot richer, and some people are still, unfortunately, very poor, but this is the average picture. And it's not just confined to the developed world. In world GDP terms, it's 11 times greater. And you can look at continents like Africa and individual countries. You can also see some change. Maybe not enough, but certainly some change. US is one of the most spectacular after all, because really the US began to develop more rapidly only after the Civil War in the 1860s. And GDP is 12 times greater than it was in 1870. Perhaps even more important, we see huge increases in human longevity, because capitalism or modern economies more broadly have downsides as well. I've hinted at inequality, the persistence of less development. We could also add to that the problem of climate change and pollution and so on. All these are big problems too, but a big plus, hopefully an unambiguous plus, is the increase in human longevity. Global average of 30 years to 67 years. And in developed countries, it's even greater, particularly in countries like Finland and the Nordic countries. The results are even more spectacular. This is a major transformation of people's lives. Apart from the fact they're better off, on the average, they're living longer because of better nutrition, because of better healthcare, and so on, various reasons. Global growth since 1700 has downsides. I've mentioned several. It was associated in the early period with slavery and colonialism and all the downsides of those things. But also inequality is increased. A key author here is Milanovic, there's several others. Look at his data. I'm not ignoring these points. Now, what do we call this period which sort of grew up and exploded from the late 17th century, 18th century, and late 18th century and through the 19th century into the 20th century? I suggest the word capitalism. I'm hesitating a bit because it's unpopular in some circles, but I'm going to make a brief case for describing this period as capitalism. It doesn't mean it's not a normative statement. We can be for capitalism or against it. It's simply understanding what's involved in this period, which we describe as capitalist. Right, if you look up a dictionary, you'll see a definition something like this. In terms of private property, markets, and so on, profit motive may be added. But the problem with that is not that it's wrong, but it is inadequate, because all those things have existed for thousands of years. We've had markets for thousands of years. And I can use markets in a broad or narrow sense. Trade goes way back to the Stone Age. We have evidence of Stone Age axes being transported across Europe, traded across Europe in all likelihood, going back tens of thousands of years. So trade in that broad sense has existed for a long time, but markets in the more colloquial sense, or places where people gather together and buy and sell, as in the local fish market or the local foreign exchange market or whatever, or markets on Amazon, we have virtually, that's another modern version of market. Those have existed for thousands of years too. There's evidence of them in 3000 BC in China. Okay, so at least 5,000 years, markets have existed. Private property has existed for that period with different systems of law and so on. All sorts of caveats must be added, but these things are old. So this is not sufficient to define capitalism. It may argue they're necessary conditions. In other words, if they weren't there, it wouldn't be capitalism, but they're not sufficient conditions. So capitalism also depends on finance. And here the major inspiration is this gentleman here, Joseph Schumpeter, who was strongly influenced by Marx and Marxism, though politically he was completely different. He's more of a conservative. But he was interested by Marxist analysis of capitalism. But he added his own important ingredient. And his important ingredient was to stress the importance of finance in modern development. And there's a quotation from him as capitalism being a system, private property economy in which innovations are carried out with means of borrowed money, which implies credit creation, development of law and practice of negotiated paper, and of created deposits, and so on. And here he signals a number of important things which are relatively novel. I'll demonstrate that to you in a period. And money is no longer lumps of silver or gold carried around with intrinsic value. It becomes deposits in banks. So you need a developed banking system. And banks are very old, but a developed banking system is relatively new. Had banks in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but we don't have banking systems in the modern sense until relatively recently, a few hundred years. And money is here signaled to be not simply stuff like gold or silver, but also credit, based on credit. So we see money more broadly is understood as a process of credit creation. More on that later. In fact, we could say much more on that later. Now, so the obvious question is, why does this sound new? Well, why is it? Why do I have to stress this point? Well, I have to stress it actually because it's rather neglected. It's neglected in some areas of economics. Not this area of, obviously there's financial economics. There's huge studies and publications on the role of finance in finance as a subdivision of economics. But in economic history, for example, it's less well discussed, and then also in other areas. And I think it's actually quite crucial. Why does this happen? Well, I show in the book, I won't give you details here, but if you're interested, you can follow up in the book. I show in the book that there's a confusion about the meaning of capital. This relates to the choice of the word capitalism to describe this modern epoch. But what does capital mean? The fundamental ambiguity is when an economist opens their mouth and says, let's talk about capital, they could mean one of two things which are very different. They could mean capital goods. The capital in this room consists of the equipment, the buildings, the seats, and so on. That involves investment. It involved the money to invest it, but intrinsically, it's different from the money that was used to pay for these things. It's the physical stuff, okay? So a lot of economists, when they talk about development, they talk about capital accumulation. They mean accumulation of physical things, machines, buildings, raw materials, and so on. And that confusion is prevalent, and it's often, I quote passages in the book, the ambiguity teases you because it's not clear from the statement by, in some cases, eminent economic historians, whether they're referring to capital goods or, alternatively, finance. So the distinction between capital goods and finance is absolutely crucial. And you have to talk about these things. They are quite different. You might need one to obtain the other, but it's not always been the case. The mechanisms we use to finance the appropriation of capital goods, the purchase of capital goods, are hugely modern and very different from a Stone Age person getting a stone and sharpening it and attaching it to a piece of wood and using it as a spear. Finance wasn't involved, but the capital goods were important. Part of the responsibility is this gentleman here, a gentleman I greatly admire, like Schumpeter, very important for economics, very interesting and relevant even for today. His story about the wealth of nations, from which I steal my title, is a very important story and has important insight. But unfortunately, he did one thing which I think set economics back in that book, published in 1776, Wealth of Nations. He actually described capital as physical things. And this is pointed out by economic historians, rather neglected, but actually it's a significant change. I think that the explanation for this is for people like Smith, quite understandably at the time, who were Enlightenment thinkers. They were celebrating and understanding and looking at the new scientific and engineering developments of the 18th century and incorporating insights and inspirations from it, particularly from physics and engineering and industrial change and so on. And Newton was a great figure, and Newton was understanding the universe in terms of physical laws. And I think Smith, historians of economic thought dispute the extent, but I think there's evidence that Smith was, to some degree at least, influenced by people like Newton. And this physicalist view of the economy as a physical machine generating stuff has unfortunately, in my view, dominated economics ever since. I mean, you may ask what should replace it, but try and answer that in my book, but I'll talk about that if we've got time. Another piece of evidence is, this is a great book, which I recommend, by Mark Kiyama and Jared Rumin, How the World Became Rich. Why is it a great book? I think it's because it's an excellent survey. It's a well-informed and balanced survey of explanations of economic development. So something to recommend to students. I would recommend it. However, it's got one defect. It doesn't discuss finance as a cause of economic development. It's a lacuna. It's a big hole in the book. There's many other things which are important because they are important. I'm not proposing a single explanation of what's going on. Many things were important. I just think the role of finance is neglected. Other things are important too, like culture, like ideas, like the development of science, like technology. All these things are important too, but finance, I think, was also crucial, and that is neglected. So from that point of view, which I establish in the book, you may disagree with it, but taking it forward, the agenda is to look at key changes from roughly 1600 onwards, but go a bit earlier, as I do in the book. But what was happening to make finance operational, and how did it become important? What created this huge increase in entrepreneurship, wealth, and productivity? Was it due to technology, for example? Well, let's just take that as one of several alternative explanations. Again, I'm not denying the importance of it, but let's look at what was involved. In the book, I go through several explanations, including Weber, Marx, Deirdre McCloskey, several people, about how they explain this huge enrichment, as McCloskey calls it, the great enrichment. Let's just take one for the sake of argument. Technology, did it happen because of things like this? The steam engines, railways, which is early 19th century, of course. Yes, technology was important, but the question is, what caused technology? What enabled technology to become so important? So what's needed are things like this. For technology to work, it's not simply one person thinking alone at his or her desk, or one person in an attic inventing something. It's about communities, and you can see in all cases where there's inspirational, entrepreneurial advance, technological achievement, thinking. Newton, one of many examples, there was always conversation involved between people. We often neglect that. As science works, it's not neglected by my colleagues in this institution, because I know it's central to your arguments about science being a social process. But we have to remember that it was then too, even before modern organization of science, to the degree we have today. So we need communities of science. You need to actually discuss, what do you think of this idea? Oh, I've got some information you might want to use, or I've done an experiment on this. And it was informal societies and networks like this which were very important. John McKeer makes much of this in his work. And also you need political conditions, some toleration of argument and discussion. And also, as I shall explain in a minute, develop financial institutions to finance what was going on. The political institutions and some freedom of speech are crucial. I remember that Galileo in the early 1600s was threatened with torture by the church, by the Inquisition, for suggesting the heresy that the earth was not the center of the universe. He wasn't actually tortured, but he was threatened with it. Some of his colleagues were tortured. Now, this is not an environment which free thinking and scientific endeavor can occur. Scientists need to be able to say some things which appear crazy or wrong or heretical, sometimes to be knocked down. Often they're wrong, they need to be refuted or whatever, but they need to say them to part of a conversation which actually moves constructively forward, which I'm sure you appreciate that point. A good example, which is one which John McKeer in his work raises, is to illustrate technology is not enough, is the Chinese invention of printing. The Chinese invented printing about the 6th century AD, sorry, 7th century AD. And the early form, with Chinese characters, obviously, the early form was sort of slabs of text, were carved in wood or some other medium. They would carve out the characters so that they could use this to slab print a whole page. And then a few centuries later, they invented a movable type, with the Chinese characters being the individual items on the type, and they could compose sentences in this and so forth. So the technology developed over the centuries from about the 7th century onwards, but it was hardly used. Okay. It was hardly used. They were still writing calligraphic stuff in the records. It never became an important engine of communication or record keeping for business or whatever. So consequently, the fact that you even have a technology doesn't mean necessarily it's going to be used productively, which was a different circumstance in, say, 19th century Britain. So technology is important, it's vital, in fact. Without those technologies, particularly communications technology, we wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution and so on, but it's not enough. Here's Deirdre McCloskey. I've had long arguments with Deirdre. They continue always engaging and interesting discussions. But in one of her books, she says the financial argument can't be right because, she says, things like banks and financial markets and promissory notes existed in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Beijing, so on, long, long ago. And if finance is important, therefore, according to her, then why didn't these countries pioneer development? Say Florence in Italy, the city-state of Florence, why didn't that had a developed financial system with the Medicis? Why didn't that develop into a entrepreneurial economy growing rapidly like England and Britain did later? So she says that refutes the argument about finance. Crucially, she's claiming that all the developments that are necessary for this to happen were already there, say 2,000 years ago. I think that's wrong. Okay, I'll try and explain why. She's right. Banks did exist 2,000 years, even much older than that in ancient Sumer. But I argue that important institutional changes occurred, and these were sometimes prompted by exogenous shocks. So this is the second part of my argument, the role of exogenous shocks, and I'll talk about that. Change doesn't come necessarily always cumulatively. Sometimes it does, often slowly, but it does happen that way. But often rapidly changing circumstances force people to do things and to solve new problems with some urgency. So exogenous shocks are important. You see this also in biological evolution. By the way, I'm long interested evolutionary thinking, evolutionary theory, insights from biology, and so on. And we see that in biological evolution, the shocks often happen and cause dramatic changes. Then shocks are often devastating. I mean, take, for example, the shock of the asteroid impact, which destroyed the dinosaurs, except for the birds, of course, who survived, about 65 million years ago. Now, that wiped out the majority of species. Fortunately for mammals, some mammals survived, and eventually from mammals we had the human species, but we shouldn't be sort of wiggish about this. It's not history always triumphing in the end. There's a lot of devastation and damage done in the meantime. But the important point is still there, that shocks are often necessary to jolt systems into change, even if there's enormous costs. Right, so back to the English case. What I highlight in the book, I start basically in 1300. The following events and shocks. I go through some of these briefly, and I'll focus on a bit longer on others. When you could go back to the Normans, 1066, that was an important invasion. But I won't go. You can go back forever and ever. The Romans, etc. But let's start in 1300. Or the 1300s. 1348, as most of Europe, all of Europe experienced, there was a plague, a Black Death, which in the British case was more severe than in several other parts of Europe, killing, it's now estimated, roughly about 50% of the population. Okay, in parts of Eastern Europe, it actually was less, and that had different consequences, but that's another story. But this shock changed things dramatically because of at huge human cost. But because of the loss of life and because of the complete obliteration of half the workforce, there was an acute shortage of labor. You had these surviving landlords with their feudal estates, previously and immediately afterwards run by serfs who were doing the hard work, and then half the workforce on average disappears, killed in the plague. And it wasn't just one plague, it was a succession of repeated infestations through that century. That changes the relative bargaining power of the parties, and by various methods the serfs freed themselves. It wasn't done by collective revolt. The peasants' revolt later in that century failed. It was done by saying, take us on new terms, or we shall go, basically, to the Lord. Maybe not divulging the latter information, but so many renegotiated their terms and became free laborers rather than serfs, with some bonding by contract to the Lord. And some just simply flew, just took flight and went to another parish, another county, and became installed as free laborers. And because of the shortage of labor, they determined the terms and conditions. So this basically ended classical feudalism. It ended feudalism. So the Marxist account, for example, celebrates that, but it gets the reasons wrong, or ignores the main reason, which was the Black Death. And there's more and more evidence about this role of flight. So it's an exogenous event. Now, the Reformation, which apparently was an internal event, Henry VIII and his wives and all that, and wanting to marry to divorce someone, and the Pope not agreeing. So it's partly internal, but it was huge in its effects because because of the break from Rome. It meant that Henry VIII had the opportunity to use the assets of the Catholic Church. So they moved into the possession of the Church of England, but he had the opportunity to use that huge wealth, which was previously owned by the Papal Church in Rome. And that too had major effects. All sorts of things happened. And exogenous pressure became important then too, because the break from Rome had implications in terms of antagonism, or increased antagonism from countries like France. And so there was preparation for war. And what Henry VIII does, he institutes this thing called knight service, which is a way, and taxations, to try and get the landowners to pay more money to finance his war efforts. And because this becomes a point of resentment and dispute for the next 200 or 300 years. English Civil War. I mean, this is one of the most romantic and sort of stirring periods in English history, but the result of it was not very much. Those in power remained in power, and the king came back in 1660. But there were some mechanisms leading to land disputes, and there was discussions about freehold versus copyhold. Sorry, I have to go back. Restoration 1660, again, this led to pressure for new legislation to serve the royalists who had been reinstated with their property rights. And 1688 is the biggie. Okay, I want to talk more about this. This is a Dutch invasion. Now, you've probably not heard of the Dutch invasion. You probably heard of the Glorious Revolution instead. That is a bit of spin, okay, a bit of propaganda. It's a bit of spin, and if even serious historians come up with the excuse for calling it a glorious revolution and not an invasion, on the grounds that they were invited, okay? And I've seen the invitation letter. It's available. You can find it on the web. It was signed by a number of eminent people who weren't representative of anything. They were simply drawn from various prestigious groups, the aristocracy, the army, the navy, and so on, one of each of those cases. Some from the Tory party, some from the prototype Whigs. So they're carefully selected. And what they said was, William, please come over and help us. We are having trouble with our king, who wants to reintroduce Catholicism, okay? Which is true. He was going in that direction. But what they didn't say is, William, please be king, or William and Mary, please be king and queen, or please overthrow the king. Please help us. It was simply vague help. Now, so it's not even a plea for a new king, which happened. Now, the thought experiment, if in 1940, Hitler had actually began mounting an invasion of Britain, which he could have done if things had gone slightly differently, if the Battle of Britain in the air in the summer of 1940 had been lost by the Royal Air Force, then Hitler might have invaded. He would have no problem in finding 5 or 6 people to sign a letter inviting him over, right? And we would no longer call that as an invasion. We would call it the glorious Hitlerite invasion, or the glorious Nazi arrival, or something like that. This all spin, this historical spin, and historians get deluded by this. It's an enormous invasion. And here is a picture, not a photograph, of that invading force. It's literally hundreds of ships, thousands of men arriving, and they're arriving very close to where I live. This is Torbay in Devon, near Brixham Bay Area. And it is, I imagine, a fairly accurate representation of what was going on. This huge army decamped, then moved towards Exeter, which is not far away, about 30 miles away, or 45 kilometers, if you like, and stayed there, hoping to get support from local gentry and others, which happened, of course, and moved forward. But it was it was as big as the failed Armada of almost exactly 100 years earlier. Right? So 1588, the Armada didn't actually arrive, but it came to invade, but was blown off course and partly destroyed. This was as big as that. Right. Now, on that event, we have this very, very famous and very important intervention on the tricentenary of these events by the Nobel laureate, Douglas North, a very great figure in this area. His work is inspirational. He's the one most responsible for introducing institutional ideas into economic history. So his contribution is extremely important. And he co-authored this article with Barry Weingast, who's still with us, And they the central argument is this. Basically, what happened after 1688 is that the army arrives, it moves, and it stays in Exeter, then moves towards London, and then and the Royalist army supporting James II congregates on Salisbury Plain and then takes fright and defections start. Okay, so elements of the army start defecting to the other side. And so William's army moves forward. It's not bloodless. A few were killed. Only a few, but nevertheless, it's not bloodless. Arrives on the outskirts of London. By the time they get there, James, the king, flees. He just flees for France. And eventually there's a later battle in Northern Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne, 1690, where he's finally defeated. Okay, so William comes in and he calls an election. Asks Parliament to call an election. An election is called, and they spend much of 1689 discussing about who is going to be king. Right. And they end up with a compromise, having William and Mary, because Mary is a Stuart. She's a sister of the former king, and they find a legal pretext for dismissing James II from that post. Now, this is new. This is Parliament being involved in who should be monarch. I mean, there was no discussion in Parliament when Queen Elizabeth died last year and Charles II took over, Charles III, I beg your pardon, took over. No discussion at all in Parliament because the rules are laid down. It's predictable and straightforward procedure. At least in this case it wasn't disputed. And historically it has been. But then in 1688-89, Parliament was involved. It was making the reasons up why James II was no longer king, and making the reasons up why this joint monarchy with William and Mary should occur. So Parliament was put in a position of power which it hadn't had before. Right? On this point, Noyce and Weingast are right. The balance of power shifted, but not through legislation, right? Not through a bill, a new constitution saying, now Parliament shall do this and the monarch can do this, and the monarch can't do this and Parliament can do that. That wasn't what happened. The basic constitutional framework remained the same. There was a few things which they added to it, but it was not constitutional. So they get that point right. It's a crucial point that the balance of power shifted for these complicated de facto reasons, right? Rather than rewriting the constitution. And then they add to that what this meant was that property rights were more secure. So before then, allegedly or in imagination, there's always this threat of confiscation, and there was. There was sometimes. It was nowhere near as bad as in some parts of Europe, but there were some confiscations, like Charles II seized money in the Royal Mint, and they had to repay it back eventually. But these things were relatively rare, and there's no legal rewriting of the rules. There was no change in the precedents of common law, for example, or no legislation about property rights. And this is the view and the basis of the criticism of many historians. They basically say that the revolution was defensive. What was happening was that James II was removing traditional rights and protocols and also moving towards Catholicism, favoring Catholic interests more and more, which was a religious threat as well as a threat to property. But he'd overridden some claimed rights which had been there for long before, including in the Magna Carta in the 13th century. It's a standard view by historians. So despite the insight about the valid point about the balance between the Crown and Parliament, North and Weingast have been heavily criticized for this other part of the story. Property rights were relatively secure way back under Henry II we've got the evidence for this. Obviously, if there's civil wars or treason occurs or something, you get your property confiscated. And also for poorer people who had no access, no means of financing a legal suit, it would be very difficult to protect transgressions of property, and they occurred. But for a feudal system, relatively speaking, property rights were relatively secure, or like an early modern system. This is made by several people. And we take one example, right? The reason why property rights were secure, in particular land property rights were secure, but what couldn't happen is for the land to be mortgaged or sold easily in many cases. There were some freeholdings, but they were generally a minority of the land held. The big estates were what is called in law entailed. Entails is a system by which land is kept in the family, which means that the current lord of that manor, that estate, has all sorts of rights of use and profit from the land, except the right to sell it. Okay, and because the family want to keep the source of power, which is the land, and the family arranges to restrict that right for even the head of the family, so that the land is passed on to the eldest son and so on down the system and keeps within the family. And entail still exists. Still much of English land is governed by entails. And entails, they're important because they stop sale and thereby stop mortgageability. It means you cannot use the land to raise capital in the sense of finance capital because you can't mortgage it. A point largely ignored. Okay, but it's absolutely crucial. So it's not the security of property rights that matters, it's the kind of property rights that were there. And when I started off on this research about a decade or so ago, my imagination was to find events in the 18th century when more and more land was disentailed. Now, sure enough, I found that evidence, but it was actually too slight to make a difference. So the picture becomes much more complicated, but I'll come to that. Entails were important and neglected. So we need an alternative story. 1688 is still very important for reasons I shall add in a minute, but key financial institutions developed in the Netherlands and the UK. The Dutch connection is crucial because they'd already pioneered institutions in the public finance and in the private sector, which were adapted and used in the British context, copied from the Dutch by the Dutch connection. You need many more banks than there were before, mortgaging, markets for debt, stock markets, and so on. These changes began before 1688, particularly after 1660, with those royalists wanting to do things with their land. But financial developments were accelerated by the Dutch invasion for reasons I'll come to in a minute. Those reasons are that one huge effect of that invasion in 1688 was to completely upturn Britain's alliances. Okay. Previously, Britain, during the 1600s, had largely been allied with France and Spain. Despite them being Catholic countries, the enemy was Holland, the Dutch. Okay. The Dutch invasion, for obvious reasons, upturned that completely. So it became a Protestant alliance in Europe against Catholic interests. And then Britain was plunged into more than a century of nearly continuous war as a result of that. And I'll come to the intensity of that war in a minute. There were wars in the 17th century, the 1600s as well, including two or three major wars against the Dutch. Okay, so, but the scale of this transformed. So the alliances completely changed and Britain became a war economy. It was mounted up for war. It was ready for war. Some people quite rightly, including Sombart, Werner Sombart, the German historical school guy, called this war capitalism. Yes, it was capitalism born in war, developed in war. So this is one I go into more detail in the book, but take Neil Ferguson, another context, the historian. The 12 biggest wars in history. He does this by a simple population measure compared with deaths globally. Okay, 6 of these wars were in this period from 1688 and 1850, from the 9 Years' War to the French Revolution Wars and Napoleon Wars. All of these wars were involved in England. So, taking by globally constructed death rates, civilian and army deaths, naval deaths, these this intensive period of war ranked by these biggest wars in history. Of course, 2 of them are in the 20th century. Right, so here I differ from Schumpeter because the evolution of capitalism is not simply from within. I mean, Marx also tends to go in that direction by seeing the development of a system as solely or largely internal, which is a kind of Hegelian idea, the internal logic of something, working it through. And this influences both Marx and Schumpeter, and I think Schumpeter neglects this, external events. So these are important. And as an historian, or political theorist more accurately, political historian and political theorist, Charles Tilly, is on the ball with this, because he, in his books on the evolution of states in Europe in this period, he emphasizes contestation and war preparation and defense preparation as being absolutely crucial in the development of European states. And in addition, the multiplicity of states, unlike, say, China, at the same time, in the area, meant this rivalry did promote those institutional changes. Unfortunately, even when he emphasizes things like capital accumulation, he's talking about material stuff and not finance. So he neglects finance or brings it in under some kind of false pretenses. Now, this is a very good indicator of what's going on. This is in a couple of articles, part 1, part 2, by Peter Grahl and Peter Murrell, published in the Journal of Institutional Economics, which I currently edit. And it shows case law studies with modern data sets and modern artificial intelligence software. You can extract this data, called machine learning is one of the terms used, and get a picture of changes in rules and disputes over categories in law, for example, and get a picture of the rate of change. So the frequency is the number of cases where a particular instance or classification of legal issue was being discussed in the common law courts, okay? Lots of common law courts meeting and lots of cases being heard. And this is a measure of the intensity of debate. Now, intensity of debate means that things are not settled, right? Because you have to discuss and nuance individual cases. When it peaks, that means things have begun to become settled, and then when it goes down especially, then things are more or less settled. So this is about negotiable bills and notes. This is treating money as more than physical stuff, treating money as bits of paper and promissory notes, as well as that. The big change is about 1675, somewhere around that, and then goes up during and becomes very, very important during the 18th century. Then claims of financial institutions. Again, there's a similar story here, but some undulation. Repaying debt. What are the rules about repaying debt? For example, if you're owed money and you die, does the person have to repay debt to your heirs? Right? Simple questions like that, which are not necessarily solved with sufficient clarity, and they have to be disputed and dealt with. Now, the one I think is most important is this one: mortgages. So discussion about mortgages, and then eventually settling it and it gradually going down. So mortgageability becomes an issue. Mortgage law becomes an important question, and the mortgage law gets reformed. It's reformed here and then fine-tuned onwards. So eventually land is more readily mortgageable if it's not entailed. The entails become the problem. Anyway, with this kind of data, we have a kind of picture of institutional change responding to outside events and leading to cumulative discussion inside the legal system to get the rules right to deal with the new problems. Okay, so I think McCloskey is wrong. There were major institutional changes and they coincide with the period just before and after 1688. And we date the Industrial Revolution to the second half of the 18th century, thereabouts. And we can see the relationship on all of these to that period. So this is the financial revolution, which precedes the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So involved in this, there's 50 years of dealing with mortgage law, making it more suitable to modern circumstances. One of my challenges to Deirdre McCloskey in an email when we were discussing this was to say, find me a land mortgage before 1600. Right? So land has been property for centuries before that. And some of it was freehold, actually. But I said, there may be one or two, but find me one. Can't do it. You can find, after the 1600s, you begin to find them. There's studies of them. And later on, you get more and more of them, but there's hardly any. Mortgage law was just antiquated, stuffy law, which wasn't used. It was just too difficult to use. So we have this period, which I'm talking about, the financial revolution. The consensus now has shifted more towards the view that it started before 1688, largely as a result of the aftermath of the English Civil War. So the English Civil War didn't change things itself, but the settlement after the English Civil War did, and that became important. So we have this 50 years, which widely accepted by historians has been called the financial revolution, which is creating a system to finance war. Okay, the Bank of England in 1694 is set up primarily to finance war. Okay. It institutes new institutions like new rule systems like the national debt and so on, but that's what it's set up for. Gaulish Revolution, the Bank of England founded, and the beginnings of the national debt. Before that, it's crown debt. It's the king's accounts. Now it's the national debt. And that's instituted and managed by the Bank of England with servicing of that debt and provisions for repayments and all sorts of things. And then, because mortgaging becomes more important, I'm not saying it overwhelms the issue, it doesn't. That was my disappointment in my early years researching this. But there are increasing markets for debt, because if the capacity for mortgaging exists and banks are more and more lending money on the basis of collateral, which could include land and it could be other things, they were mortgaged too. Patent rights, for example, were mortgaged. Because of those things happening, what banks do is what they do now. They hedge the risks. They made a risk with making a loan, so they split the loan up and they sell it off. They sell the debt. And that became a nightmare, another nightmare for legislators, because there wasn't clear rules. Again, about someone dying, or was the money stolen originally? Does that invalidate the contract? All sorts of questions like that were complicating the issue, and they had to be sorted. It wasn't until the 1750s that began to be sorted with someone called the Earl Mansfield, who actually is the pioneer of English commercial law. And then as late as 1760s, the bank is taking different responsibilities by actually helping to bail out in some circumstances or buffer the impacts of crises on the private banks. And so this is the beginning of a process by which the Bank of England becomes more than a war financing machine. And as late as 1826, with the Joint Stock Bank Act, another reform, and then banks becoming corporations. Previously, there were partnerships, which were vulnerable to one of the partners defaulting or whatever, or going bankrupt. Anyway, it's a long story. The diagram here, this is the national debt as a percentage of GDP. So 100% is just about here. 100% is when national debt, which is of course a stock item, is equivalent to a flow item, which is GDP over 1 year. And there wasn't such a thing as national debt before 1694. It grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. And the Industrial Revolution occurs during that period. Now, I could go into all this, but I would quickly mention it. There's a discussion now amongst post-Keynesian economists about debt financing, and there's a great book, for example, by Stephanie Kelton called The Deficit Myth, and it's set in an American context, arguing against successive US presidents, including Democrats, about this worry about going into debt and saying it's not necessarily, as long as you have control of your own currency, sovereign debt can be ramped up. There are implications for it, as Keynes and others, and Minsky is involved in the story too, argued about. It's a kind of Keynesian story, which is very, very topical, okay? So when I show people this graph, I think some people will remark about this, going up to 200%, that's still possible, and even in that period, you have the Industrial Revolution going. And according to a Keynesian, this is not necessarily a negative thing, because this is making more money available. The fact that the state is a debtor, or the public purse is in debt, means that other people are in credit. There's an inverse to it, and this can be part of the story. Okay, I'm going to have to cut the rest of this short because I'm going on too long. But conventional wisdom is that finance didn't matter. Now, I'll give you many quotes. Give you one. Long-term capital, little long-term capital was demanded. So there's a true story here. The true story is that much of the lending was from friends and family. True. The other part of the story is they were not strapped for cash greatly anyway. False. And I'll give some examples why. Alex True, an economic historian from Scotland, said conventional wisdom, which is referring to on finance and the revolution, goes against a large body of empirical evidence that it matters in other countries. So this is a crucial argument for today. Does it matter? Does the financial system matter? The British experience is historically unique, and not everything matters in the same way. But does it still matter for say, an African country or an East Asian country or someone like that to have a working financial system which can service investment in things required? Oh, here's one case study. I'll be rather quick. This is Bolton and Watt. And as you probably know, they founded a steam engine business, which changed the world. And here's the technical innovation. They took a former steam engine by a man called Newcomen, the Newcomen engine. They made this innovation of adding a second condenser. I won't go into technical details. This required a more sophisticated technology. You got the technology from boring the second, this piston condenser, because the fit had to be more close than on the Newcomen engine. And someone invented a way of boring cannon into cast iron more accurately. And he was waiting for this invention to occur. And because it occurred, he waited about 5 years to find out a way of doing this. And this guy called Wilkinson patented the cannon boring technology, which of course is prompted by war. And with that innovation, he could construct this device, this piston device, which with a sufficiently close fit to make it work. And the steam engine, hey presto, the steam engine business starts. And Bolton and Watt patented this design in Cornish tin mines. They were so strapped for cash that they couldn't manufacture their own engines. So they sold it in the Cornish tin mines because Cornwall's got no tin. No, sorry, Cornwall's got tin, but no coal or other fuel. Okay, coal had to be imported to Cornwall for the tin mines, which was a vital commodity, from South Wales, partly by sea. Very expensive business getting the coal there. Coal was much more expensive, whereas in the Midlands or the north of England, coal was cheap because it was abundant. So they tried to sell their engine for the coal mines of the Midlands or north of England, they would be less successful because coal was cheap anyway. And the fact they halved the use of coal, made it double the efficiency, wouldn't have mattered so much because coal was cheap. So they went to the place where coal was expensive and sold it in Cornwall. And they sold it by license because they couldn't afford to build engines themselves. And there's evidence that they were strapped for cash all the way through. There's some magnificent stories here, really great to read. There's some serious studies of this enterprise. They were constantly short of cash, and they had to delay their own production of steam engines, which became much more successful later on. They invented the rotative engine rather than this crude double condensing system. And that they manufactured themselves, but eventually got the cash to do it. But they were constantly trying to find ways of going for cash. Why is this neglected? Well, property rights is an important thing for economists. There's even a section of economics called the economics of property rights. Doesn't mention mortgages. It can't mention mortgages because it defines property as simply control. And the whole point about a mortgage, as people like Hernando de Soto emphasized, is about legal title. Right? What's important, what's missing in this account of property is the issue of legal title. As J.L. Commons, an American institutionalist, said once, a property contract is between three people. Right? Not just the people doing the transaction, but the state is there hanging over, backing up and enforcing or restricting certain rights. And among the people that changed my mind or illuminated my thinking over this are two German scholars, Heinz and Steiger, recommend in English their ownership economics for discussion of that. So this is one of the problems in economics, is a rather limited sense of what property means, rather than looking at the legal aspects of it, where it is actually a bundle, a structured bundle of rights of different kinds. So you can own property, for example, without having the ability to sell it. So financial institutions and legislation were vital. And then we have the second conundrum, which I hinted at earlier. The conundrum is actually, there wasn't a massive disentailing of the land so that lots of it could become mortgaged. I wanted to try and find that, but I quickly realized that that information was not to be found, or at least wasn't happening. And this is because while the Industrial Revolution was spectacular in terms of the innovations and some of the physical changes in the landscape with the mills and the pollution and the railways and the canals and all that, at the same time, it was relatively slow in GDP terms. And relatively slow in 1770, 1920, it was less than 1% a year, which is actually quite slow industrial growth. And it was after the Industrial Revolution that growth began to pick up to 2%, become more important. But that's another story. So finance is important. That point still remains a fortiori, but because it's important because also the lack of finance was important. The fact that there were still restrictions on borrowing, including things like usury laws, which were not abolished until the 19th century. So, final piece of empirical evidence, this is one bit I did, which is to look at a data set which has not been used before in this period. There's a study for the 19th century by Alex True that I mentioned earlier on this. This is what are called bank partners in country banks. There were London banks, legally they were called London banks, and outside London, they were called country banks, and they're under different legislation. And the country banks are very important for financing enterprises outside the London area. And we have data on the number of bank partners. They're all partnerships. So if we simply aggregate in any year the number of bank partners that existed, that's all the banks, enumerating all their partners and saying what's the overall number of bank partners in this sector, which is for England and Wales. you get this figure here underneath, and this is an index of industrial output here from a recent data or recently contrived data set. Of course, there's not much action until the middle of the 18th century in terms of the role of the country banks here. But at the same time, this begins to pick up. So there's a prima facie evidence that access to finance through the growth of the banking sector and using the number of partners as a proxy, a crude proxy indicator of the amount of capital, finance capital available to the bank to use, we get those figures. And if we regress them, that's the number of bank partners, we get quite an impressive result. Very simple statistical test. Lots more work needs to be done, but I think this does impressively give us a case, at least to pursue, that the banking system was very important in getting industrial growth going. Also a great book by Callum and Harbour on this, and they point to the same problem about the lack of finance and say the contradiction between the spectacular growth in entrepreneurial activity and innovation with slower growth is understood in these terms. So what we need to investigate empirically and state these questions, it's remarkable how little work has been done on this by economic historians, is really to get some figures, some data on the true fact that a lot of borrowing was done within friends and family, but how much? We need to know more accurately, rather than simply assuming this was the main way of financing. And then lending intermediaries, banks or other institutions, how important were they? Need data on that. And the extent to which mortgaging via landed property or other collateral was important. Again, there's a dearth of data, and this is really an important topic. This whole area has been neglected about the role of finance in the Industrial Revolution, needs to be shifted on the agenda and underpinned by more extensive research. So obviously this has implications, as I mentioned already. I'm definitely, to repeat myself, not saying that every country can or should follow the British example, but that we have enough prima facie evidence to know that access to finance and the development of the financial system is very important in economic development, including in countries, African countries. So to go further with this, we need to take the cue from that evidence. In the book, I have a short half chapter on Japan, where I look what happened at Japan. And I think while the actual story in its detail is very, very different, you do get the importance of exogenous shocks in Japan, and you do see the importance of the growth of the financial system related to its military expansion as being relevant. So in those senses, I think there's some corroborative elements. I published 2 articles on this. It's my first one, 2017, which was in honor of Douglas North in 1688. A later one in the same journal. This book discusses some of the issues, but I go into much more detail on this book. So my time is coming quick, already overrun, but I want to thank you very much for your attention and time.
Jeff, thanks very much for this excellent talk. We have now time for discussion, and Professor Jari Eloranta kindly agreed to kick off the discussion section with his comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. This is, first of all, there's a nice turnout too, which sort of underlines the importance of a topic like this. And of course, your work is familiar to a lot of Finnish economic historians and economists from various publications, which you mentioned. So it's very nice to see that, and especially the stuff about institutional economics. So you've been a very influential figure here in Finland in the development of some of those ideas, including my own work. At first, I wanted to just reflect on, throw a couple of ideas at you and see what you think of it. because this was an interesting talk, but there's also a lot of other stuff that probably is in the book that we could perhaps discuss further. And you sort of touched on it in at the very end of your talk. So you mentioned the UK case and perhaps how much we can generalize from it in terms of developing world. And perhaps we can, maybe push back on that a little bit in terms of if a functioning financial market will be something that will spur on economic growth in an African nation, for example. Next week, in fact, this is a very auspicious time for us here in Helsinki. We'll have James Robinson visiting as well. So two pivotal figures in institutional economics visiting within a week's span. Very nice. But of course, he might say then, okay, we should look more closely at some of the, like Doug North, the institutional securities and the way that the sort of micro structure of the economy function, that's more important to get the financial markets to actually function. We reduce corruption. We need to have a stronger state that can sort of enforce some of the rules that the financial markets can function. So that was my first sort of thought. My second thought perhaps comes from the New History of Capitalism literature, which in the US is very prominent. So it has to do with colonialism, and sort of it ascribes a lot of the kind of the US economic growth over the centuries to colonialism and exploitation. So can we see a similar strain in the British case? So if we can go back to some of the older dependency theories, Marxists, Wallerstein, others who then say that the British case would be a sort of prime case of exploitation, and that leads to economic growth and industrial revolution. Of course, an economic historian, I'm fairly skeptical of that view if we look at work of Patrick O'Brien and others. Now, this is one quick thing also about my own research interest currently is about state capacity in the long run. I wanted to get your thoughts on that literature as well as something that, so maybe our view of the states have often been fairly skewed. You already talked a lot about the kind of warfare and how that shaped the state, perhaps the finances of it. But perhaps we can also think of how do states sort of develop capacity, as a capital instead of a stock, as a stock instead of a flow, like we often measure it. So in the British case, can we see something in the development of the state that becomes a state that encompasses some certain principles, institutions that are beneficial for capitalism, growth of capitalism in the UK case? Now, my final question or comment would be, then you had an interesting graph there about private banks and industrial output. The little cliometrician in me was very interested in that. So I already started thinking about, what variables are missing? What can we do here? Causality and all those things, endogenous. So that I think that's an interesting direction. I've seen some similar work in the US case with John Wallace, for example, another great institutionalist, and Naomi Lamoureux. They tried to do some of these kinds of stuff. But I guess my sort of obscure question would be more about, should we look at certain types of indicators or proxies to try to measure a capitalism? So are there other ways we could look at and sort of find instances of capitalism and when it sort of happens? So I think having different sort of indicators will probably give us more perspective on when and how these systems develop. So last, I wanted to thank you for a great, inspiring talk. I think we'll have a really nice discussion.
Thank you very much, Jeff, please.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for those remarks. You're absolutely, on the last point about the little graph, clear, I'm missing out lots of stuff here, and it's very preliminary. I'm simply indicating a path for future research. And hoping that others will join in with that, because it's not something we can do on our own very, very quickly. We need lots of researchers working on the area. Gathering data is time intensive, as you appreciate. And of course, if we go further, we will find things that we need to add and to change. But I think it's a plea to actually take finance seriously. That's my point, and giving a primitive indication, rudimentary data, rudimentary correlation on its ostensive importance, and it's in that spirit which I'm putting it forward. Your point, your other point about you made 2 or 3 points about colonialism. Yes, I missed that story. I put it in the book about the growth of trade and the role of empire. I'm not so sure what the consensus opinion is. Perhaps you could inform me about, was the empire a economic positive or an economic negative, or to what degree? And I have read a lot of stuff which was not that important. It was a kind of remnant. It was a more militaristic territory grab than a sound economic investment. That may or may not be true. I'd be interested in current views on that. But what was for sure is that the access to that trading zone, expanding through empire, was of vital importance. The growth of the British trading sphere against other parties, against France in particular, against Spain, and part collaboration with the Dutch was extremely important. And you can see that feeds in to case studies of financing and so on. But also important in that is slavery. And I think, again, there's a point missing about slavery. I mean, slavery, was it profitable? Was it not? Would wage labor on the plantations be more efficient? The economic historians have been debating that kind of question quite rightly for decades, not necessarily with conclusive arguments. But the key thing about slaves is they are mortgageable. One quarter of British wealth, assets owned by British people, British entities, legal entities. At the end of the 18th century, 1/4 was human beings, slaves on plantations. Slavery was actually illegal on the territory of Britain, but of course, throughout the empire, we had huge slave labor involved, which was actually taken away from people as property in 1834. So if you're owning a slave, as many people did, so the slave trade was ended, I think 1806, 1807. 1834, you could no longer own a slave anywhere, even in the colonies. That's an example of Parliament making property insecure, as Hoppet and others have pointed out, but for good reasons. And the owners were compensated. And what did they do with the money? A lot of it was invested in railways. So the finance, which was embodied literally in a human person being owned by others, could be used as collateral. Slaves were mortgaged. There's a great movie called 12 Years a Slave, American slavery. The guy was mortgaged. It's actually in the script of the movie. It's possible to mortgage a slave, and people did. And also, when they were lost the slaves, slavery was ended, they were compensated with that capital, that finance. They actually put it into things like the railways. Large amounts did. So, yes, the empire was important, trade was important, and slavery was important. The big question, of course, is, could the Industrial Revolution and those changes have occurred without slavery? I mean, I don't know the answer. My feeling is possibly it could have done, but it would have been a different story because slavery was so important. Now, your second point about state capacity and state building, I think is the big question. It's really, because the story here I gave you, although finance was a more commonly spoken word, the state lies behind it. It makes the legal system's there, and legal system is part of the state. The state public finance, as developed in Holland originally, in the Netherlands, and then transplanted partly to the British context, developed there too, is part of the state, the state finance, state financing, and so on. And so state